in self-supervised learning, you have a really good clustering, and these clusters are actually aligned with semantic labels.
Welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. We host early career academics and PhD students to share their cutting-edge research in computer vision, machine learning, and everything in between. I'm your host, Itzik Ben Shabbat, a researcher by day and podcaster by night. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. Today we will be talking about the paper Reverse Engineering Self-Supervised Learning. This paper was published in NeurIPS 2023, and I'm happy to host the author of the paper, Ravid Shwartz-Ziv. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi. Yes, so my name is Ravid, and I'm an assistant professor and faculty fellow at NYU.
And who are the co-authors of the paper?
So the one that did most of the work is Ido Ben Shaul. Now he's finishing his PhD at Tel Aviv University. The other guys is Tomer Golianti, and now he's at MIT. Also Shai Dekel from Tel Aviv University, and of course Jan LeCun from NYU and FAIR and Meta.
Quite a team.
Yeah. It was a really great team. Like, well, all the coaches were really good, and I was really I enjoyed to work with them, and it was really amazing. They had such a great ideas, and again, I think it's a great paper. It resulted in a great paper.
Me too. So let's start talking about it. So in a TLDR kind of format, 2-3 sentences, what is this paper about?
So we try to look and we try to understand what is the learning process looks like in self-supervised learning. And we try to understand what types of clustering the learning process induced in self-supervised learning, and how can we define and how can we represent these classes and compare them to different kinds of or different frameworks of learning that we already know.
All right, this sounds super interesting, but already there are quite a few terms that people that are not familiar with this specific problem that they don't know. So let's try to break it down for everybody, and let's start exactly. So let's start with what is self-supervised learning. Let's say that there's someone that doesn't know yet.
Okay, so self-supervised learning is a very so recently it's very common types of learning framework, and most of the time you have two different views of some input, and basically you don't have any kinds of labels or supervised labels, and you want to understand or to extract patterns that you have in your data. So you have two types of two versions of your input, and you want to find some representation of this input that will help you to get good results in some downstream task. Okay, and how people are doing it. It can be that you have, for example, an image and some rotated version of this image, okay, or some augmented version of this image, and basically you try the main concept. There are a lot of different methods, self-supervised methods, but the concept is that you want to put the representations of different versions of the same image together, and you want to put apart versions of different images, you want to make them in some distance from each other. Okay, and
Right.
it can be in vision or like other domains, but the idea is similar.
Right. So let me quickly recap, right? So usually when people talk about learning, right, they're talking about supervised learning, right? Let's say we're in vision, you get an image, you have a label of that image. Let's say we're talking about classification problem, right? Just to keep it simple, right? So you have an image, you know, this is an image of a cat, you feed that to the network, you have some loss function that tells the network, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a dog, whatever. Then this is how you train the network. In self-supervised learning, you don't have the label, right? You don't know that it's a cat, but you get two versions of this cat. I don't know, it's rotated or flipped or something like that. But then you say, okay, I want to push these representations closer together in order to get like this unique representation that can allow me to do something later, right? Maybe it's classification with some additional fine-tuning, but essentially it allows you to train without any labels.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true.
Okay, so this brings me to my next question. So why this is an important thing to work with, right? Why do we need self-supervised learning?
It's a great question. I personally believe that self-supervised learning is all what you need. And especially in this area, right, we have so much data, but most of it is unlabeled. And like we need to understand how can we learn from all these data. It can be text, it can be images from the internet. You want to take all the images in the internet, but you don't have labels. So you need to understand how to use them. And in this case, self-supervised learning is a great tool because you don't need labels. You just can use your input and your data and to find patterns in it.
Right. And it kind of makes me think about, how kids learn stuff, right? You don't go with your kid and say like 1,000 times, look, this is a cat and this is a cat and this is a cat, right? You tell them once or twice and then, okay, this is a cat.
Right. Yes. That's true, actually. Like my intuition. So I did my PhD in neuroscience at the Hebrew University. So this was actually like my intuition for self-supervised learning, and like we had previous papers about compression in self-supervised learning, and this is exactly the idea that behind it.
Okay, so now we know why it's important and some of the intuition behind it, but what are the main challenges here?
So the main challenge is how to learn. Right? As you said, in supervised learning, it's very easy. You have labels, you have all the things all the information that you need, and you have a specific evaluation. Okay, now I just need to get good results on the labels. I need to predict good labels. But in self-supervised learning, you don't have it. So you need to make some proxy for this. Proxy loss functions or something else that will create these good representations. And it's not clear what are these representations. So currently what people are doing, they're training self-supervised learning, whatever, in some way. And then they are trying to take this representation and to test it or to fine tune it on some downstream task. Okay, and basically you say, or other people say, so what is a good representation? What is a good self-supervised learning method? It's a method that gives me a good result on a downstream task.
Right. Yeah. And these are like super challenging stuff. And I think this is one of the reasons I really like your papers, because you're not all about, okay, let's get a new method that beats everybody. It's about, let's understand what's going on here. Right. And this leads me to the next point of, okay, so what are the main contributions of this paper?
Yeah. So again, so a few months ago, Ido, that did again all the works and all the experiments, and most of the staff came to me and say, okay, so I don't know actually what does it mean a good representation, and why self-supervised learning is good. And I say to him, yeah, me neither. It's a great question. Let's try to understand it. So this is exactly what we try to do. We try to look with different tools. We try to look on the representation, and we try to analyze the representation itself, not only the downstream task that we have, or the accuracy, the performance on the downstream task. We try to look on the representation itself, and we try to see how well the representation, when we are looking on different systems of classes. So we looked on the clustering properties of these representations, and we actually saw that these representations really have a strong clustering during the self-supervised learning training. And these clusters are really interesting because you don't have any knowledge or like explicit knowledge about these classes during the training. You don't give the network explicit labels or explicit knowledge, but even though you don't have it during the training, you still see a really good clustering that each cluster represent some feature or some label that is related to the downstream task for different downstream tasks. It's not only for one of them. So this is like one of the highlights of this work, and we looked on different system of classes. It can be semantic classes, for example, the labels that people are giving. If it's a dog or a cat in the image, it can be random classes. What are the randomness level of the labels, and how this feature affect the clustering. It can be different hierarchies. For example, if we have some hierarchies of labels, how this affect on the clustering, and many others. So I think, this is the most key contribution of the paper. We have other interesting results. For example, the rule of regularization. Okay, we try to decompose the loss function of different self-supervised methods, and we try to look on different parts of this loss and how this decomposition effect on the learning process and the representation that we have in the learning process.
Right. Yeah, these are super interesting contributions. And I think, again, like a lot of the audience of this podcast is like vision people that are all about the new method, the beats, the state of the art, has some bold numbers, right? Yeah. And this paper, it's not one of those papers, right? It's about analyzing and understanding what's going on in the background of these SSL or self-supervised learning methods, and kind of to show that the learned representation, like what is it learning? Why like showing the clustering effect and the role of regularization and all those kind of things. So, but before we dive into the details, let's talk a little bit about related works. Okay, so which papers do you recommend someone that's coming to read your paper? Where should they start?
So I think, first of all, like it's good to know self-supervised learning methods in general. There is the SimCLR paper, and there is, of course, the VCREG paper that we mostly focused on, and also there are other self-supervised methods. There are a lot of them. So I think it's good to read these papers. And also, there is a paper of PN that called the prevalence of neural collapse during the terminal phase of deep learning training. That in this paper he showed some, or he presented some of the tools that we used in our paper. And also, if you want, we also looked on, or we used some information theory tools. So you can look on it in some of my previous papers about information theory and deep learning.
Great. I'll be sure to put links to all of these references in the description so people can just go and read those. All right. So let's dive in. So what did you guys do? Let's start breaking it down.
Yeah. So what we wanted to look, so we took self-supervised learning method, or like different methods, and we train it, and like with this method without labels. And this is important. Like, we didn't present the labels during the training. We tried it on different data sets, like mostly like vision data sets, CIFAR 100, also like ImageNet, Food 101, and many others. Okay, we augmented these images. Okay, so for each step, we put different augmentations of the image, or different augmentations of different images, and we trained with a self-supervised method. Okay, and after it, or like during the training, we looked on different measures and different things that related to the representation, that basically says what is the quality of the representation, or like different measures of the quality of the representation. Okay, so our main measures for clustering, for example, is the two quantities. One is the class distance normalized variance, or CDNV, that basically you're taking the variance of each cluster, and you divide it by the distance. Okay, and why it's a nice quantity? Because it's very intuitive. What is a good representation? What is a good clustering? It's good if the variance of each cluster is really low. Each cluster the points around each cluster are concentrated with a low variance near its mean, and also the different clusters are there is a distance between different clusters, because then it's much easier to classify them correctly, to separate between the different clusters. Okay, so this is the first quantity. Another very common quantity is the NCC, or the nearest classes center. That basically you can think of it as a measure of separability. Or if you're taking a classifier, if you're taking a very simple classifier and you try to classify, you're doing like k-means or something like that, and you're trying to classify based on this very naive clustering, then what is the result that you will get? What is the separability that you will get? So both of them are very common quantities for clustering measures. Okay, how well you can cluster the representation. Okay.
Right. So you have those two quantities that basically measure the quality of the clustering, right?
Yes.
So
right.
What do you do with those?
Okay. So then we try to look on. So then we try to look on them in different scenarios. So we took a version of ResNet, for example, and we look on this representation. So the first thing that we looked on it is how these clustering metrics behave during the training. And what we found actually, so I didn't say it, but it's very important. So each cluster, when you are talking about clustering, you need to talk about what are the labels. Even though you don't have the labels during the training process, you still need to say, okay, so now I'm clustering with respect to this label or with respect to other labels. Okay, so at the beginning, we looked on two different clustering systems. One is the original or the semantic labels. Okay, so we are taking ImageNet, okay, or CIFAR, and for each image, you have what is the label of this image. Okay, so this is one kind of clustering. And another one is per sample. What does it mean? It means that, remember, we're taking how we calculate self-supervised learning loss. So we're taking different samples or different augmentations from the same image, and we are trying to make them close together. So we can say that now what is the label for each image? So the label is the label is the original image. Okay, so we are taking different augmentations of the same image, and each one of these augmentations is we are putting a label of the same label as the original image. Okay, and now you have a lot of classes. Basically, it's a number of original images that you have, and you want to ask what is the quality of this cluster. Okay. And what we found, so we found a very interesting phenomenon. We found that at the beginning, okay, first of all, if you look on the general trend, each time each of these clustering systems or clustering or label systems is going up, is increasing during the training. Okay, both for the per sample and both for the original one. Now, the per sample clustering is not surprising, right? This is exactly what we are training our network to do. We are training it to cluster different versions of the same image together. This is exactly our loss function. So this is not surprising, but what was a bit surprised is that also when you are looking on the clustering with respect to the labels, to the semantic labels, you see a really big improvement of these cluster. Both if you're looking for the NCC and also when we looked on the CDNV, both these quantities.
Right. Now, so let me quickly recap, just to see that I understand what you just said, right? Yeah. So basically what you're saying is you took the data, you augmented it, right? And then you trained it with the SSL, and then what you basically saw was, like, there are two things to talk about here, right? One is clusters with respect to, like, the original image, right? So each image, it has, like, I don't know, 10 or 20 or how many augmentations that you did. And what you want to see is that it maps to a representation that they should all be kind of closer together. But this is kind of expected to happen because this is what you're training it for, right? You're giving it two augmentations of the same image. You have a loss function that kind of pushes them to be close. So this clustering is not surprising. But what is really surprising is the second point you mentioned, right? That if you look at the clustering with respect to kind of the original ground truth semantic labels, then it still has this clustering effect. That's really interesting.
Exactly. And not only that we see that we have this improvement in the clustering original labels, but we actually saw that most of the improvements, so the first phase of the training process for the first 10 epochs, we see improvement of both of these clustering systems. But in the second phase, like in the much longer phase, we actually see a bigger improvement for the semantic label clustering. Okay, so most of the training process is you see an improvement not on the per sample clustering, that this is like the loss function itself training on, but you see much bigger improvement on the original, the semantic labels clustering. And again, this is very surprising because it's quite of counterintuitive, because this is not what we trained our network, our self-supervised training, right?
Right. It's not in the objective function, right? It can't be, otherwise it would be supervised. So it's really nice to see that it actually learns those kind of relations, even though it doesn't have the supervision for it.
Exactly. And again, it was quite surprising, but really cool to see it. Yes. Now, the next thing that we tried to look, we saw that there is a clustering process during the self-supervised learning training, okay? And the next thing that we wanted to look on is the information. So do we have a more or less information in the representation? And this is related to previous work that we looked on information in the supervised case. And in the supervised case, what we actually found is that we have a really strong compression. And this compression, actually, there are some theoretical arguments that say that this compression gives you a better generalization ability. That if you compress your representation more, generalization will increase. So you have one of the secrets, if you want, of deep networks is exactly this compression, that you don't use all the information. Okay? And so this is in the supervised case, and we wanted to look on it in the self-supervised case. And what we found is that the information, when we measure the information during the training process, we saw again a really strong compression. And this compression, again, it was related strongly correlated with the clustering of the semantic labels. Okay, so intuitively, what we see here is that the clustering are the clusters are becoming much more concentrated, and this clustering process basically compress all the irrelevant information, all the things that are not related to the features that you will use after it, or the semantic level features. Mm-hmm. Yes, and again, it was quite surprising because there is no a direct term or direct regularization that's supposed to do it, but still we found it in different scenarios and different methods.
So you're basically saying this is something that's well known, that this compression, it's well known for supervised approaches, but you found that it also happens and works in self-supervised ones.
Yes. So again, in supervised learning, it's not surprising because you have the labels and you can compress, or the network can compress all the information that is irrelevant, that doesn't appear in the label. Okay. So basically you train the network to ignore all the information that it doesn't need to. But in the self-supervised case, you don't have the labels. You don't have explicit labels, but still the network compress the representation. So this was really surprising.
Yeah, it's really surprising. Actually, I guess maybe I'm challenging you a little bit here, but how do we know that it didn't end up throwing good information anyway, right? So you have the compression, and it might have thrown out some stuff, right? We don't know. Or do you?
Yeah. So okay. So actually, we don't know. So we have recently, like, we published a theoretical work about information in self-supervised learning. Yeah, me and Jan, if you want, you can find it. And in this work, we discussed actually what is an optimal representation, like theoretical optimal representation from information perspective. And what was really interesting is that we found that the optimal representation depends on your assumptions. So it really depends on your assumptions. And if you assume some assumptions, then you can say, okay, so now I know what my assumptions are, and then I can derive an optimal representation and optimal solution. And now I can talk like how the network will not throw out the relevant information, or like the information or the features that I want to use for the downstream task. But here I don't have it, right? I don't have this optimal solution, or like the assumptions, and basically I related on the augmentation. So in some way, the augmentation implicitly define what are the features that the network wants to compress, and what is the relevant information.
Oh, that's really interesting. So in some way, I guess you can say that the augmentations kind of encapsulate some of your assumptions, right? You're assuming that the information that you need is in those augmentations, and it's going to keep that.
Exactly.
Really cool stuff. Okay, but back to this work.
Yes. Yes. So we found that there is a really strong compression, and it was quite surprising. And then we want to try to understand, like, what are the factors that influence on this clustering process? Why we see it? Okay. So in general, for each, or like most of the SSL methods, you can decompose them to two terms. One is a term that the invariance term that tries to put together input from the same different versions of the same input. Okay, different images, different augmented versions of the same image. And there is the regularization term that basically tries to prevent collapsing of the representation, and it tries to put some distance between representations that come from different inputs. Okay, and for example, in SimCLR, you have the invariance term that tries to put them together, and the regularization term is the contrastive term that basically you look on other examples in your batch and try to make them different as possible. In VCREG, they replace the regularization term with some constraint on the entropy. They looked on the covariance metrics, and they try to regularize their covariance metrics of the batch. But again, it's the same idea. You want it to prevent from collapsing. You want that different versions or like different inputs will have different representation. They will not collapse to the same representation. Okay, so we try to decompose it. In general, like, you have these terms, and you just train them together, and we try to decompose it and to look on them separately. And what we found, and it was quite surprising again, is that during the training process, they behave really differently. So the invariance term that that you have that put the two inputs from the same image together is actually almost doesn't change during the training process. What is actually the term that actually that is changing during the process is the regularization term. That it's, you see a really big improvement of this term during the process, and this term is correlated with the downstream task accuracy, right? The measure that what we really want to check. This is the downstream task accuracy, and we see that the improvement of this task is correlated with the regularization and not with the invariance term. And we checked it in different scenarios with different regularization, and we found similar results.
Wow, I want to take a minute here because I think this is a really interesting find, right? So you decomposed it to the invariance term and the regularization part, and then you kind of trained it all along, and you kind of wanted to see what's happening with each one of these two terms, right? And you saw that the invariance term kind of stays flat, stays constant. It doesn't change much during training, but actually the regularizer is what improves. And in my head, the way I see it is like you start off in this kind of like these bunch of blobs, right? And what happens is these blobs kind of keep their own distance from like within themselves, but they kind of separate from each other, right? This is kind of what's happening, right? You're increasing you're making each example different from some other one, but keep like for the same example, it stays closer together.
Yes, exactly. And I think, and again, I agree with you. And my vision is, or what we saw that it's very easy to cluster input together, to cluster like the different versions of the same input together. Like basically the network do it in like really few numbers of steps. It's really easy, and you don't need a lot to do it, but you don't get a lot of it. And like if you really want to classify it correctly, or what is the real secret of the representation is that it's push the different clusters, it pushes from each other. And like then only after you have distance between the different clusters, then you can classify, and then the classification of the downstream task is much more easier.
Yeah, I can kind of tie it into some intuition, right? It's kind of like asking a person, well, how does a cat look like, right? He will describe the cat has a nose, it has eyes, it has whiskers. But then you can say, well, a dog has a nose, a dog has eyes, a dog has not whiskers, but something similar, right? But then if you ask a person, well, what's the difference between a dog and a cat, right? Now you're talking about contrasting between the two. Then you're starting to get like the information that really distinguishes between these two classes.
Exactly. And this is, again, it's related to the compression, because this actually, the regularization term actually tells you what you need to compress. Okay, this is exactly the contrastive term that we talked about it. Like this tells you, this is the important information that you have, and this is the unimportant information, the irrelevant information that you have. And it's much easier to define or to discuss or to represent the important features if you know what are the irrelevant features that you can compress them, and you can use them in order to classify it correctly.
Yeah, really interesting find. Really, really interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, I also think so. So the next thing that we wanted to look is we try to compare. We try to compare the representation between supervised and self-supervised case. Okay, and what we looked again on NCC and the different kinds of clustering, And we try to compare between the training and the testing data sets, between supervised and self-supervised, and how the augmentation affect on these representation. And what we found, so in supervised learning, people already found a thing that's called neural collapsing. What does it mean? Neural collapse means that basically the representation for each class collapse to some constant representation, that all the examples, all the samples from the same class, they have the same representation. Okay, and of course you have different classes, and you have different representations, but you have this strong collapse. And what we found. So first of all, we found that you have also, it's not you don't have such a strong collapsing as we have in the supervised case, but we still have this neural collapsing. And also we found that in the supervised case, this gives you like it makes a gap, the generalization gap, the gap between training and testing, or you overfit. It makes the overfitting on the training examples much worse. Okay, but if you're looking on self-supervised learning, you don't have this overfitting. The collapse is much better, and you have basically you almost don't overfit on your training with self-supervised learning, and the representation, it's much better. And this is one of the secrets of self-supervised learning. You have a much more diversity in your representation. It's much more. You can use this representation for different downstream tasks, and not only for one downstream task, as we already know from previous work.
Right. It's much more modular in that way, right? You can just plug it into some different downstream task and use that. And I mean, to me, it kind of makes sense, right? Because in supervised learning, well, the network can always like memorize a couple of examples that it's not sure what to do with, and that's it remembers it. It has nothing to do with the generalization, right? And then messes up the test scores because it's actually spending a lot of capacity or whatever to just memorize these examples. So you get that. And then in self-supervised, you can't memorize, right?
You don't have it.
Exactly. You don't have that. Right? You can't memorize.
So exactly, and it's related to the collapsing. So in the supervised case, you have basically this collapsing that you just ignore like all the features that don't tell you this is the right level. Okay, and basically like it throw out all of it. And it's related to the compression. It's related to collapsing, and all of these stuff are related. In self-supervised learning, you have you don't have the label, so the network actually can't do it. It can't throw all the information. It must store some of the information because it doesn't know what is the important information, what are the important features. And this is like for if you have multiple downstream tasks, this is much better and much more robust to different tasks, or like the change if you change between training and testing. And also we have like works about using it for using self-supervised for transfer learning. So it's much more robust to transfer learning when you change the distribution. And this is exactly because the network doesn't compress or doesn't throw out all the features.
Yeah, and this is really important, right? Because a lot of the learning stuff is, well, like the main question is how does it generalize, right? You don't care how it's doing on the training data, right? You want the test data, something that is never seen before. The generalization is the important part, and this is really nice.
exactly. So you need so. Yeah, so I just want to say one more thing. So related to what you say, so like my point of view of the thing is that you need to compress your representation, but you must know what you need to compress. Like there are two parts, and each one of them is super important, and you can't get a good result with only one of them.
Important distinction.
So yeah, exactly. Okay, so the next thing that we wanted to ask is what is what type of classes we the network can learn, like self-supervised learning can learn in a good way. And the way that we try to do it is we try to look on different levels of randomnesses. Okay, so we want to look what will happen if we inject noise to the label. So how the performance or how the clustering will behave when you have different features or different types of randomness. And the way that we did it is we looked on, so imagine that you have in one side you have like totally random labels that they don't contain any information about anything about the label. They're just random. In the other part, you have the semantic label that these we considered as like the most important, like not the most important, but like the gold of the gold classes. Okay, that someone actually say to you like this is what you have in the image, and we want to look on this range between totally random and semantic labels, and the way that we actually shift between these two. So we trained a network. Okay, so we looked on a network that we initialized randomly. So we looked at the prediction of these network as our label. So at the beginning of the training, or the beginning of the supervised training, and again, it's important. This is like a different training process, and it's not related to the SSL at all. We just use it to learn different kind of classes. So at the beginning, you have a totally random network with totally random predictions, and this induced some classes. And now you are training it with the original, the semantic label. You train it, and each time you took each step as the randomnesses of the labels, of the prediction. Okay, so at the end of the training, the network knows how to predict well the labels. So it's very close to semantic labels. And we can take, for each step, we can take the predictions and we can look on the clustering and the clustering process that we have with respect to these labels, okay, with different amount of randomness. So this is what we try to do.
What did you find?
And what we, okay, so these, okay, actually, it wasn't surprising at all. Like, this is exactly what you will expect from this kind of experiment. Well, what we found that you have a really strong correlation between the randomness levels and the clustering performance. As you have more random, as your labels are more random, the performance, the clustering is worse. And when you are getting closer to the semantic levels, your clustering becomes much better. And not only that, as that the training process, and now we're talking about the self-supervised learning training process, the training process of the SSL affect much more on the semantic labels. Okay, so you almost don't see any effect for the self-supervised learning training process when your levels are random or really close to random, but you see a huge effect, a huge improvement when you are looking on semantic levels, or you are getting closer and closer to the semantic levels. Okay, and again, this is not surprising. We expect to see, like, we don't expect that the self-supervised learning will improve on everything, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense, and it's some kind of a no free lunch theorem, if you want. Like, you can without any assumptions, or like if it's totally random, probably there is no reason to believe that your presentation will improve. But if you have some kind of information or signal in your data, then you see that the self-supervised learning training process actually improve your results and your performance and your clustering ability on these clusters. So this was, again, not surprising, but very interesting. We also looked on the different layers, and we found that, again, as we expected, as we go deeper to the network, the representation becomes much better. Okay, and also the representation, as you get more and as you become more and more random, or your levels are becoming more and more random, then the effect of the layers is not so significant. So if you have random levels, all the layers are basically the same in terms of their representation. But as you have more and more information, and as you have more and more signal in your levels or in your clusters, then the layers actually separated, and you have distinguish between the different layers and their ability to represent and to cluster the labels.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. So you also looked at hierarchies, right? What did you do?
Yes,
there?
Exactly. Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, because in real world labels, if you want, you have a lot of hierarchies. Like, you have hierarchies, you have a lot of clusters, right? You look on the image, especially if you look on a real image and not like, I don't know, C410 or something like that. There are a lot of different types of labels that you can find, and like, these labels are ordered with some most of the time, or some of the time, these labels are ordered with some hierarchies. And we try to look on this question and to see the clustering, how the clustering process changed during the training with different hierarchies. So what we did, some data sets have natural hierarchies. For example, CIFAR 100, you have the classes, the classes themselves, and for each class, you have some subclasses.
I think it's important to give an example here, because some people don't understand exactly what hierarchies are, right? So maybe the let's say the label is a type of fish, right? Blowfish, clownfish, whatever. Then the superclass would be fish, and then a superclass to that would be animals, maybe, I don't know.
Exactly.
And you can subdivide it into higher hierarchies. Sorry, go on.
Yes, exactly. So the bottom line is that what we found is actually the clustering process is also really strong for these hierarchies. Okay, so it's not only that, right, you can say that, okay, so you have clustering for all the cats, but they look basically the same, or like really similar to each other. So it may be that it's not surprising. But also, if you're taking all the animals, all like different, like really broad a range of classes that you group together based on some semantic similarity, we found that like a really strong clustering. And again, it was much stronger than what the per sample clustering that actually the network trained on. And again, it was really surprising.
Yeah, it's really surprising. It's really interesting because you were talking about the regularizer, right? And how it kind of starts off with this kind of cluster things and pushes the clusters away from each other to do the separability thing. But now basically it's not doing it like randomly, right? It's not pushing everything in like different directions just to be far away. It's basically pushing, let's say, the feline family like in one way and then separates them. If we're talking about cats.
Exactly.
So this is really cool.
Yeah, and what we found also, and when we looked on it for the different layers and for the different training dynamics for different times during the training, we see that like the different layers actually learn differently the superclass and the classes themselves. So, for example, like at the middle you have, like at the beginning you have layers that are specialized in the superclasses, versus at the end you have a more separation for the different classes. And it's very interesting, and it may be a really interesting direction to look what can we use this observation when we want to learn downstream tasks. For example, it may be that there are different layers that are good for different types of downstream tasks.
Oh, this is a great bridge for the next part, right? Conclusions and future work. So yeah, you already started it. So how do you see the impact of the paper going forward, and then like which projects or future ideas, future work you think should follow?
Yeah. So again, we only started in this project to look on the representation. There are so many such an interesting questions to ask. For example, to extend it to language models, right? Language models or masking or other types of language models, they have kind of a self-supervised learning, right? You basically, you don't have the labels and you try to make representations with good, for good downstream tasks. And it raised very interesting questions about what is the representation that we have in these models and why, and how it evolves during the training and how it evolves with different data sets. And this is actually a question that we are trying to address right now. So if you have like a good ideas, let me know. You can find my mail, and it can be very interesting. And other types of things is like to try to compare. So we have different types of learning: supervised learning, self-supervised, unsupervised learning, and even in these classes or like these frameworks, we have different types of methods. For example, masking, right? What are the differences between these methods and why? And what does it mean about the assumptions? We talked about briefly, but the augmentations, right? In self-supervised learning, the augmentations, they are really a strong prior of your learning, right? You basically says, I know what is the same image. The image that I rotated is the same as the original image, right? But for masking, it's really not unclear, like, what does it mean that you're masked and then you're trying to reconstruct your input? How it's related to the clustering, and and what is the difference in the representation between this and to the augmentation? So I think these are really interesting questions to ask.
Yeah, these are super interesting questions to ask, because like, I mean, a lot of the methods that come out recently are just about, beating the state of the art. And I think these questions are the more interesting ones, right? Why is this happening? Why is it working the way it's working? What's under the hood? Like, is it doing clustering? Like, what's going on? What are the assumptions here? So really super interesting future directions.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like that also you can take these observations. I really like to first to do these observations and like to ask these questions, fundamental questions about representations, and then to try to take our lessons and to apply them to different tasks. So I say that we did it for transfer learning, then we took like self-supervised learning, and we tried to understand what is the information and how can we take more information to do transfer learning. And now we are trying, like, based on this work, we actually understood that the regularization term is much more important than we thought before. So we are trying to apply it also for different scenarios, and like we are trying to apply it for supervised tasks and different kinds of problems and different regularizations that inspired from the self-supervised learning regularizations, and we see really good results that they improve. That when you improve your presentation, you actually can improve your downstream tasks and performance.
Yeah, definitely. I think like there's a peak of that in the paper, right? You had like this one of the charts you compared supervised and self-supervised learning, but also like supervised with augmentations, right? Exactly. This is somewhere in the middle, right? Because these augmentations already exist in the self-supervised one.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Right,
exactly.
It feels like we can keep talking about this for hours, and we kind of need to wrap up soon. So this brings me to my favorite part of the podcast. What did reviewer 2 say? So please share a bit of the review process and what comments the reviewers had.
Okay, so I just want to say that like reviewers, like how to say it. So most of the time reviewers are really good, but you need to take them with a grain of salt, and like it doesn't mean that if you have like bad reviews, it doesn't mean that your paper is bad. For example, like one of my most famous or like the cited paper, the opening the black box paper actually got rejected like with really bad reviews. And it ended up with really impactful paper. So yeah, you need to take it in the right perspective. So about the reviews of this paper, so most of the reviews were actually told us that, oh, this is a very interesting paper. You have a lot of very interesting observations and analyses and stuff like this. But like we want to look on broader to see that it's replicating more data sets and in more methods and networks, and like we want to see more, and we want to make sure that this is not just like very specific to the scenarios and to the framework that you tried. And this was actually it was true, and it was like when you are doing a paper and when you work on something on a project, so you can take like two different directions, two different approaches. I think one of them is to say, I will just from the beginning I will try on many data sets, and I will try to see like some observations on a lot of different scenarios. And one of them is to say, okay, so let's take one or two data sets and let's try to different experiments and different observations and different conclusions. And this is like, it's very hard to do both of them. And most of the time you need to take like only one path. And this is what we did here. And the reviewers told us like, and they were right. Like, we want to see that this is more general, because if it's not general enough, it's not interesting. And like, it may be interesting in this dataset, but we want to say something much more generalized that we can take. And we want to say that like, now if I have a data set and if I have a method, I want to know what is going on with the representation, and we want to make sure that this is actually we can apply your observations on our problem.
Yeah, I mean, I want to first like comment on the first thing you said. I think this is like the best tip ever, right? Even like those 1,400 citation papers get rejected. This is gold here, right? This is so important for, especially for new PhD students, like submitting the first paper, getting the rejection. It breaks your heart. You get so discouraged, but it happens to everyone. This is exactly the academic world.
Exactly.
And about this specific paper, I mean, yeah, it seems like in recent years, a lot of the reviews are a lot about, okay, but try this data set and that data set. However, I don't think this is the case here, right? Because like you had like all of these nice observations, and it's a valid question. Well, what if you take a different data set? Do those kind of conclusions still hold? And it's really cool that you actually showed that it does, right? These are stuff that you added after the review process, right?
Yeah, I agree. Like these are like, let's say, different scenarios. When you come up with a new really cool algorithm, right? So it may be important just because it's a really cool algorithm, and like I don't think that or like it's not necessary to try to break all the state of the art in all the different tasks, because you just have a cool algorithm. But if you're doing these kinds of analysis, and you're trying to analyze your presentation to make conclusions about your presentation, you want that it will be generalized enough, and that you can generalize it to other problems.
Yeah, but also like, sure, this could be endless, right? You could always ask for another data set, and it can never, like, you have to draw the line somewhere, and the line is usually the submission deadline, and then you submit it, if it gets in, then
the line is 1 minute before the deadline.
Exactly. All right.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so in this optimistic note, I think it's a good time to call it a day. So
yeah, I just want to say thank you again to all my collaborators that again basically did all the job and make all the experiments and everything. They are really amazing.
Yes, of course. All right, Ravid, thank you very much for being a part of the podcast. And until next time, let your papers do the talking. Thank you for listening. That's it for this episode of Talking Papers. Please subscribe to the podcast feed on your favorite podcast app. All links are available in this episode description and on the Talking Papers website. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, sponsor it, or just share your thoughts with us, feel free to email talking.papers.podcast@gmail.com. Be sure to tune in every week for the latest episodes. And until then, let your papers do the talking.